Today, we are going to talk about something that is a little obsolete. We only have one exam objective to cover today, and that is going to be configure forest and domain trusts. Now, trusts themselves are not obsolete. Forests, on the other hand, are kind of. It doesn't actually say in the exam study guide that you need to cover and understand what a forest is. However, it is implied in this objective that you know the difference. So we're going to really break this topic down into a couple different ones. We're going to talk about what a forest is versus a domain, what a couple different forest formats look like, and lastly, we're going to cover trusts and give you a basic understanding of what trusts are. Now, when I'm making the statement that forests are obsolete, I'm basing that on a couple of things. One, Microsoft themselves don't recommend using a multi-domain or a multi-forest setup if you can avoid it. There are other ways to achieve the same advantages you might get out of using them that are going to be simpler if you just have a single domain configured. There's also the fact that they were initially designed for replication barriers and security barriers, and there are just better ways of doing that nowadays. This is also based on the fact of not many places are doing it anymore anyways. I went and talked to one of my coworkers who has been an Active Directory administrator for a couple of large international corporations, and I asked him if he had any multi-domain configuration or forest configurations that he was supporting in those companies. And he said in both cases they were using one single large domain, which is what Microsoft recommends. So I kind of took that to mean, on top of the fact that my personal experience, I've never seen a multi-domain setup, I just kind of assume no one's really using them anymore. But we're going to talk about it. We're going to explain what it is so you have an understanding of it. It's not too complicated. And then we're going to talk about trusts. So let's go over a forest setup first. A forest always starts with what we'll call a parent domain. Now, for our lab today, we're going to start with our parent domain controller, which is running a domain we're calling apex.local. Now, the first way that you can set up a forest, which makes really no sense at all, is in your forest, you can have what's called a second tree domain. The tree domain is going to be a completely separate domain name from your root domain. So in this case, we will have, if you were doing a tree domain, you'd have a second DC, and that would be called something like, we're going to call it eu.local. In this case, they're in the same forest. The forest is called apex.local still because it's named after your parent domain, but these are essentially independent from each other. In order for any user or resources in apex.local to resolve this domain, you have to have conditional forwarders set up for DNS. Nothing resolves back and forth unless it's specially configured that way. And then you still have some of the shared forest resources, which is going to be things like enterprise administrators and schema masters. We'll go over what that looks like first person when we actually get into the lab. But essentially, these are two independent domains that have almost nothing to do with each other. Setting up a tree forest like this is essentially the same thing as having a completely separate domain and forest with a two-way trust. We'll go over what this looks like. But the more common forest setup that you will see is, rather than having your secondary tree setup, what you'll have underneath your parent domain is a child domain. And in this case, I'm running out of room here. This would be a subdomain of apex.local. So you'd have EU dot and then apex.local. And this is still in the same apex.local forest. Now, it's still similar from a permission-wise perspective as the tree domain, but the difference is every user or resource from here will be able to resolve apex.local because it's a parent domain. So any resolution would go check here. If it doesn't exist, go here automatically. So it's a lot more native, intuitive from a DNS perspective on how things work. This is what we're going to be setting up in our lab today, is a child domain setup versus a tree domain setup. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is trusts. I'm not going to have too much to whiteboard here, but the one thing to know for trust and to understand is really the trust direction. Microsoft uses the terminology incoming trust or outgoing trust. I used to really struggle conceptually with how to understand those directions. So I've kind of come up with an illustration in my mind that I use to understand what is being set up and referenced. Let's go ahead and draw that out. The way I think about this is, think of you and a neighbor as an analogy. I've got you, and you've got your house, and you've got your neighbor, and they've got their house. Think of a trust as your set of keys and what you're trusting access to your house. When you think of trust directions, you want to think of what direction those keys are being given. So you have your set of keys, right? And you're trusting your neighbor to access your house. That is going to be an outgoing trust because you are giving your keys to your neighbor, and now you trust that your neighbor can access your house and he's not going to steal anything. Likewise, an incoming trust would be your neighbor trusting you with their keys. This is all from the perspective of the person doing the trusting, right? Whether outgoing or incoming, it'd be the opposite for them. But this is the way that you want to think about directions for trust if you're configuring them. You do have two types of trusts. You have outgoing and incoming, and those can be set up independently. You don't have to have a two-way trust. You can have a one-way trust, which is what we're going to set up in our lab, and then you can have a two-way, which is both trust each other. That's as much illustration as I was going to do. I think this is going to start making more sense once we get into the lab and kind of see it first person and we're configuring it. So let's go ahead and cut over and see what this looks like. Just as a side note, if you're running Terraform deployments and it finishes and you didn't see the output or the IP to connect to, a really easy command to use is just Terraform output, and that will spit out the public IP address that we can use to connect. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, we are connected to our first server here, and this is going to be the apex.local domain controller. If I pull up Active Directory, we can see I've got apex.local. This is pre-configured by our Active Directory automation that's available in our AD lab video if you ever want to set this up yourself. Otherwise, this is part of the lab deployment. It comes with groups, it comes with some people populated, it comes with some of the AD permissions like domain admin already populated. But we're not going to do anything with this domain. This is ready to go. So the first step in our objective is we're going to go ahead and configure a child domain as a member of this forest. So I'll open remote desktop here, and we're going to connect to 10.0.0.6. If you're doing this in your lab, there's notes on the different servers and their associated IP addresses. DNS is not going to work to connect to the server name out of the gate because this is a domain controller. It's depending on itself for DNS, and it doesn't know about these other Azure resources yet. So the first time we connect, we have to use the IP address. But we are connecting to the server we're calling EUDC1. The illustration that I'm going for this is we have a company, Apex, that's creating another domain in Europe. So we're going to create that child domain as eu.apex.local. So we're connecting to our EUDC1 server, and this is going to become the domain controller for that child domain. Fast forward a little bit here so I can load up. All right, we are in our EUDC. So just like we did in the previous lesson, we first have to install Active Directory, and then we have to promote this to a domain controller. And it's on the promotion step where we configure the forest. So I'm going to fast forward through here while I go ahead and do those simple things until I get to the promotion screen. Okay, we are at the promotion screen, and this is where we get to select where we're going to join it to an existing forest. So in the last lesson, We created add new forest, or we selected add new forest when we were creating a domain from scratch. Then when we promoted our second domain controller, we chose the first option, which is the most common. This time we're going to go with this third option, add a new domain to an existing forest. Now, you remember there's two types. There's child or tree. This is where you select that. I can't ever envision why you'd want to pick tree. So we're going to go with child just because it's the more common thing. Now, first thing we have to choose after we choose child domain is what's the parent domain name. That's going to be apex.local. This is the root domain that exists in the forest. Next, we have to choose what our new domain name is. Remember, this domain is going to be a subdomain automatically of apex.local. You don't have to type the whole thing out. I can literally just type in EU, and this is going to make eu.apex.local as the domain. The last thing we need is the credentials from apex.local that will allow us to connect those two domains to the existing forest. So I'm going to hit change here, and I'm going to type in my credentials for the parent domain apex.local. Just to make that more obvious, I'm going to use my user principal name format, labadmin@apex.local. And hit next. And cannot log in a domain. Now, why can't we log in? I guarantee my credentials are right. This goes back to the same prerequisites we had when joining a domain controller to an existing domain from the last lesson. If you don't remember what those are, you should pause and think about it. And if you don't need to remember, or if you can't recall, you might want to go back and watch that first one, because this is going to come up over and over and over again. The two requirements for joining a server to a domain: you have to have network connectivity and you have to have DNS. So let's test both those things. I know that my server for the parent domain is at 10.0.0.4. So if I ping that, I get a reply, meaning I have network connectivity. Next, I want to ping the domain name and make sure that I can resolve that. Kind of fine. So, network connectivity, DNS is not working. So that's the first thing we have to configure. I go here, and what I'm going to do is point my DNS settings on this server to the parent domain DNS server so that I can resolve apex.local. .10.0.0.4, and go ahead and set Google as my secondary DNS. Actually, I'm not going to do that. We're just going to leave it at the parent DNS. This is going to get changed once the server is promoted because it's going to become a domain controller, or a DNS server, sorry. Okay, now that that's set, let's try this again. That's working. So now we have network connectivity and DNS. Let's go back to our screen here and try hitting next again. Just thinking about it. There we go. So it works. This is the same settings we had whenever you choose, anytime you're promoting any domain controller. It's good to note also that because this is a child domain, global catalog, this will contain copies of information from all the domains. This is really what global catalog means. Does it contain all the information from the forest? Yes. This doesn't really matter when everything is one domain because every domain controller automatically contains all information. When you start talking about multiple domains in a forest, this becomes more important. But really, the setting never changes because you should always make every DC a global catalog. Hit next. This, if you remember, every other time we've done this, it errors out because we don't really have a DNS delegation. What this is doing for us is actually going to the DNS server for apex.local and creating the delegation for eu.apex.local and pointing that back to this server. So this is the one time this screen actually matters to us, and it's just giving us the option. We're going to go ahead next, so we want it to do that. And finally, we get to our NetBIOS domain name, which is the same thing as before. It's going to try and grab a prefix that you can use for this. This is going to be different than the prefix for our root domain. For the root domain, it's going to be apex /. This is going to be EU, or I could change this to EU Apex if I want. I still kind of tend to say the shorter the better because this gets typed on a regular basis by a lot of users. So I'm going to stick with EU. Next. This is going to be our installed directories of where we're putting the Active Directory database locally. That's fine. Next, next, prerequisites, and we should be able to just go ahead and install. All prerequisites checks passed. So install, and we are off and running. This server is going to install the domain controller. It's going to reboot, and once it comes back, we will take a look at what exactly was configured and start taking a look at some of the interactions between our parent and our child domains. All right, while this server is configuring itself and restarting, let's actually take a look at the DNS settings. I am back here on the apex.local parent domain controller. And if I pull up DNS, you remember there's that screen that asks if it wanted to create the DNS delegation for us. What that did is if I go into my apex.local DNS name, I now see that I have a subzone here that points to the new EU domain controller as the owner of the subzone. What that's going to do then is say any requests to look for resources in eu.apex.local, it's going to go to this EU domain controller to resolve those and return the results. Let's go ahead and see if we can connect back to the server. Actually, just because we can, let's do by name EU1 or eudc1.eu.apex.local. Hit connect, and I want lab admin at eu.apex.local, and that's what it's connecting to. Yes. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of the stuff that was configured. Now, this is going to build on our lessons from yesterday, or last week. If you remember, there are those 5 roles called FSMO roles that delegate the responsibility for specific domain-related functions that have to be done by one server. While this is loading, if I minimize this and pull up my terminal and use the command to query for those roles and say netdom query FSMO, I see that those 5 FSMO roles are all assigned to apexdc1.apex.local for this parent domain. We're going to compare that to our child domain and see what the difference is here. Okay, we've got our domain controller pulled up here, and let's go ahead and run that same command here and see what it says. Here you go. So, first difference, you'll see that for the domain-specific FSMO roles, which is PDC, RID pool, infrastructure, that's pointing to this DC, which is the only domain controller in the EU domain. However, you'll see that the schema master and the domain naming master roles have been delegated to the parent domain controller, apexdc1. So this is telling you that for the forest, these 2 roles are forest specific instead of domain specific. Next, let's go ahead and take a look at our Active Directory console here and take a look at the groups for users. Now, if I minimize this, so I'm looking in the window here for EU, and I pull up the same console over here. Oh, that's DNS. One second. Go to my users directory over here. You will see that we are missing a couple of groups in our child domain. We have everything except for enterprise admin, enterprise key admin, and schema admins. That means these, and enterprise. So what this implies is your enterprise groups from your parent domain are used for providing permissions for the entire forest and all domains within that forest. This is both for parent-child domains and also for parent tree domains where you have a completely separate domain name. These enterprise groups and the schema admins groups is always for a forest-wide delegation. Now, what does that mean exactly? If I look at domain admins here, you can see I only have one. But if I look at domain admins here, I've got a bunch of users here that I created and populated these groups with. If I try to log into this domain controller with one of these other domain admins, what do you think is going to happen? So here's my server. Let's try connecting instead with levans-da. This is one of the domain admin accounts from Apex. Hit connect. Hit yes. Bam. Connection was denied because the user is not authorized for remote login. So a domain admin from my parent domain cannot log into that child domain. However, if I look at the enterprise admins group, notice these are all accounts that end with EA, and I tried the same thing, levans-EA for enterprise admin instead. Make sure it's using the right domain account, Apex. Boom. I am able to connect using that account. So what that means is domain admins are your administrators, your keys to the kingdom for your entire domain. Enterprise admins are one step above that. They're the keys they have the keys to the kingdom for the entire forest. So if you have a forest with multiple domains in it, an enterprise admin account can access and run as a domain admin in any one of those individual domains. Schema admins is kind of similar. They don't necessarily have permissions to access the domain and edit it, but they do have access to the schema of the domain. A schema is essentially your database structure. It allows you to edit what attributes are available, some of the sub-properties, things that you really don't want to mess with unless you have a specific reason to. To give you an illustration for schema admins, there are some programs like SCCM. When you install them and when you're running version updates, you have to execute a schema extension against Active Directory for it to make it work. Essentially what that's doing is it creates a whole bunch of additional attributes then that SCCM can use to manage resources and permissions within your domain. I think Exchange does the same thing. But that just goes back to the point. Schema admins have to run from a parent domain within a forest because it's a single function that can only be performed by a single server. So to note, if you're running a forest, the two groups or roles that matter are schema admins and enterprise admins because those are central to the entire forest, not just a domain. Previously, the only thing we really cared about was domain admins because if you're running one domain, anybody who's a domain admin has right to do anything it wants in that single domain. If you extend that to a forest, it changes a little bit. Now, when I was creating this lab, initially I was going to have it spin up member servers in both the EU and Apex domains so that you can kind of see how you can enable logins across domain memberships. However, it seemed excessive to spin up 5 servers for one lab environment for a single objective. So rather than do that, let me just illustrate what it looks like to kind of enable permissions or group membership across domains. Because if you think of groups in Active Directory, you should automatically think of permissions because that's what they're used for, configuring permissions. So let's go into our Active Directory user console and let's go ahead and create a group that enables membership across domains. So first thing I'm going to do is create a new OU for groups here because this was not a pre-formatted domain. And then in this, let's create a group that would theoretically be used for granting server administrator rights in your domain. Hit OK. If I open this and go to members and try to add users, this locations field is where you select where the users are coming from that you want to add. If I click this, you'll see I only have access to this eu.apex.local domain. So how do I enable users from this other domain? If I hit OK and cancel here, go back to my group properties. When you create a group, you select 2 properties, the scope and the type. Group type is like, do you want this to be an email group or a security group? Almost always, you don't think about this because you just leave the default. I want a global security group, and that works for almost everything. When you're working with a forest, however, that's when this universal scope suddenly comes into play. If I change this group to universal scope, hit apply, and then go back to my members property and try to add, I can now see under locations, I have the apex.local domain that I can select for. And that also means that if I search for, I think admin is the prefix I used. Yeah. I now have these admin accounts from the apex.local domain that I can add to this SEC server administrators group in the EU domain. What this now enables is I could set up a group policy that says add my server administrators universal group to the admin local group on each server, and now all of my server administrators from my parent apex.local group have rights, apex.local domain have rights to access my EU.apex.local servers in the EU domain. So really the point I'm trying to get to here is if you're using groups for permissions, which you should be doing, you can change the group type to universal, and now you have access to all users from either domain, so you can use that to mess with permissions across domain. By default, those permissions are enabled, but that's how you enable like login and management from a parent-child relationship. This is something that does not work well in a tree domain, and that goes back to just like some of the DNS goofiness that comes from having two completely separate domain names instead of a parent-child. The last thing I want to take a look at here before we cut over and start looking at trusts is the DNS settings themselves. Now, if I go open PowerShell and I look at my DNS settings for the server, you'll notice when I promoted it to a domain controller, it added itself as the first DNS server, which is normal, and then it kept this 10004 reference, which is to the parent domain controller. I'm going to go ahead and take that away. Give me 1 second here. Properties, remove, okay, close, 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 close. Check it again. Now, the domain controller for this is only pointing at itself, so it only can resolve its own name. If I also open DNS, you will see that the only domain name it knows about is eu.apex.local. I don't see a reference to apex.local here anywhere. So if I type in ping, let's start with EU, this should resolve to this server, which it does. Now, if I type in ping apex.local, what happens? I still get a result. Now, theoretically, this should not work, right? Because this server, which is the DNS server, doesn't know anything about the apex.local domain. You don't see a reference to it anywhere. However, this is a child domain server. If I right-click on the properties of the domain controller itself and I go to forwarders, you will see this domain has configured its parent domain as the forwarder, meaning if it gets a request for DNS and it does not know the answer, the next place it sends that request is the forwarder IP address, which is the root domain DNS server. This was configured automatically, and this is actually fantastic. If you watch our DNS basics video, which if any of what I'm talking about here with DNS is over your head, you need to go watch that video. You should understand DNS almost backwards and forwards if you're an Active Directory administrator. On top of the fact it's not that complicated, so much of Active Directory is predicated on DNS that it's just really, really good to know backwards and forwards. But this is exactly how I tell people to set up if you're doing cross-domain DNS reference. This is the correct way of configuring. Essentially, your parent domain in this configuration is your authoritative DNS server, and if your child domain doesn't know the answer, that's where it sends a request so that it can resolve them at the parent. This is a great setup, and it's handled for you automatically when you promote this as a child domain. All of this stuff is also why I don't recommend using a tree domain. You're messing with, you're basically creating a completely isolated DNS environment, and to do any of this stuff, you have to go and manually configure it to get it to work, which is just a pain. That's actually exactly what we have to do when we start looking at trusts, which is our next topic. So let's go ahead and cut over and start looking at setting up DNS trusts. Back over here at the whiteboard, and what I was going to do really quick is I'm just going to illustrate out what exactly I'm going to configure here, because sometimes it's good to see things visually, because when you're clicking through screens it might not be obvious. We have our apex.local DC. and we have set up our child domain DC, right? So that's all configured. What we're going to do next is configure a trust to the third server that we have set up in our lab. This server is for summit.corp domain. This is the domain that I stood up in the lab, and this is going to act as basically a second company. Now think about, for this theoretical scenario, we have our company apex.local, and it is purchasing a company called Summit. I don't know what they do, it doesn't matter. But in order to merge the two companies together, Apex needs to be able to have their admins log in and manage resources on the Summit domain while they're facilitating the merger of the two companies. So what we need to do is set up a trust then from Apex to Summit. But Apex is buying Summit. It is going to take over Summit. Summit's admins don't need any access to Apex resources. So what we're going to do is configure a one-way trust. If we go back to our house illustration that I just erased, you think about who needs whose keys. Apex needs to be able to access summit.corp and not the other way around. What that means is Summit, as a person, needs to give their keys to their house to Apex, meaning the trust doesn't go this way, it's actually going this way. So on the Apex primary domain, we need to configure an incoming trust from summit.corp. Then when we go back to Summit, we can either configure this in the same step if you have all of the credentials, or I can configure it in two steps where I configure the trust from Apex side, then I go over to Summit side and I configure the trust from Summit side to be outgoing to Apex. To streamline this process, we're going to do this all from one screen so you can see how it works. And then we're going to configure all the different settings for this. There's another step to this, or another thing that's worth mentioning while we're here on this screen, or on this whiteboard. Trusts come in two different types. You have what's called a transitive trust and a non-transitive trust. What those terms mean is, if it's transitive, it means that that trust propagates to every domain in a forest. Meaning, if I have a transitive trust incoming from summit.corp and it's transitive, it means that my users from EU can also log in and manage Summit resources if they're given permissions in this domain via the trust that's established here. That's what transitive means. If it was non-transitive, this doesn't work. It means that the trust was set up between summit.corp, the parent domain apex.local, and only that works. And if I want this to work as well, I have to set up a second incoming trust to apex.local. That's non-transitive. That doesn't work. The last point I'm going to make about transitive, transivity, whatever you want to call it. This transitive settings only work for one forest to another forest. If I were to add a third forest here, and let's say my third forest has a two-way trust with this, which has a two-way trust with Summit, my third forest would not be able to access Summit resources. I would have to configure a second trust to them. It does not transition across forest levels, only within forests, subdomains to another forest. I hope that makes sense. That's going to be a really uncommon scenario, but that's transitive versus non-transitive trust. It's trusting subdomains within one forest to another. With that being said, let's cut back over to our desktop. Let's configure the trust, and we'll talk through some of the other specific settings for a trust that you'll need to know to manage. All right, we're back on our apex.local domain controller here, and we have a third server in this lab running, and I believe that server is running on 10.0.0.8. Yep, and that's going to be our summit.corp server. So to configure trusts, it's under a very obvious console. Go to admin tools, and right here, Active Directory domains and trusts is where we want to go. Seems straightforward, right? What's not straightforward, and what I want to specifically call out on this window, this feels like one of those Microsoft exam gotcha GUI questions of where on this screen do you go to configure a domain trust? Because if you click on it and I go to more actions, I don't see anywhere here to create a trust. What you have to do is right click on the server for the domain, go to properties, and then your trusts menu is right here. Now, there's something really fascinating going on here already, and that is you can see that your child domain in the forest automatically has a trust relationship configured. This is also a pretty good illustration of why forests aren't really needed anymore, because essentially all you're doing with creating a new forest is creating a second domain and establishing a trust with that automatically. The overlap as far as the enterprise admins and stuff, it can be done so easily using the native groups in a single domain setup that adding multiple domains to a forest just becomes redundant and extra work and extra stuff to think about for no reason. You should only really ever need single domain in a single forest, and if you have to trust something else, you can just configure the trust and not have to worry about thinking about all the particulars. I'm only calling that out because looking in our trust menu, you see the trust established. This is a two-way trust because here you've got our outgoing trust and our incoming trust, meaning it's two-way, and that's our child domain. You'll also notice transitive, yes, meaning it's fully trusted in the forest. So thinking about what we need to configure, we need admins from apex.local to log into summit.corp, and we don't want to trust anyone from summit.corp logging into apex.local, meaning the keys from summit.corp need to go to apex, meaning that needs to be an incoming trust, domains that trust this domain, incoming trust. So let's go ahead and set up a new trust, and we'll walk through this menu. First thing you need is the name of the domain forest that you are going to be establishing a trust with. For us, this is going to be summit.corp. And if you pause here for 2 seconds and think, will this work? I'm going to ask you that. Is this going to work if I hit next? Assuming it's going to look up this. Go back to our prerequisite. Actually, it did work, but it really shouldn't. Or it's not going to at some other point. Go back to our domain prerequisites. What do we need in order for this to work, knowing the domain is a DNS name? You need to be able to resolve DNS. Now, in a case like this, where you have two servers that are probably separate companies, separate physical locations, it's not like I can just go configure the summit.corp DNS servers as the DNS server of my domain controller. That'd be a really bad idea. Instead, what I want to do is, the first prerequisite we have is that network connectivity is established. So it's assumed if you're setting up a domain trust, you have VPN connectivity to that other domain already. So I'm going to assume that's already set up. The other thing we have to do is get DNS working. So let's go back to our DNS console quick. And what we're going to do in this case, the case of a trust, is I want to actually create what's called a conditional forwarder. Now, if you remember from just a little bit ago talking about the EU domain, the forwarder is what the next server that's being hit if a server cannot resolve that DNS name. A conditional forwarder is a little different. A conditional forwarder is saying any requests for the specified DNS domain go to the servers that I specify in this menu. So the DNS domain that we're going to need to resolve is summit.corp, and the IP address of the DNS server for this that I should be able to hit from here is going to be 10.0.0.8. In a real environment, this might need to be, it depends on how your VPN is set up. It might need to be a public IP address of this DC. That'd be kind of unusual. Otherwise, you'd have to make sure that your IP address to the resource you're trying to get to is resolvable. But hit OK. I know in this case it is. And if I want to test this, I can now go to ping summit.corp, and it will use the conditional forwarder and get a reply, and that is good. So DNS is established, our network connectivity is established. Let's go on to the next thing. So I want to do trust with a Windows domain. I think that it did this because it couldn't resolve DNS. It was trying to figure out what is what. Now that I have this fixed, I can set this to a Windows domain, hit next. And this is asking, do you want a non-transitive or transitive trust? It's got different names here, external versus forest. I want to do a transitive trust because I want clients potentially in the EU domain to be able to manage Summit resources as well. So hit next, and here we go. What direction is this? The keys are coming from Summit to Apex. We're on Apex, so that means it's going to be an incoming trust. Users in this domain, Apex, can be authenticated in the Summit domain. And then here's the other menu I was telling you about. I can either set this so that I configure the trust just on this side, and then I'm depending on the admins in the summit.corp domain to configure their end. Otherwise, if you have permissions, like let's say you coordinated with the IT department for Summit ahead of time, they created you a domain admin account that you can use for setting up this trust. In that case, I can do both this domain and the specified domain, and that way I only have to go through this menu one time and it will configure the trust on both sides for me versus having to do it twice. That's what I'm gonna do here because it's a lab and I'm kind of lazy. Now it's gonna ask me, what are your admin credentials for that remote domain? Lab admin. And all right, here's the last major decision point you're gonna have. There's two ways to configure authentication for this. If I do forest-wide authentication, it means that I have the ability, similar to the way I did it in the EU domain, where I can go ahead and create groups that have members, and it doesn't matter where they are. As long as the users from that remote domain have permissions configured, I can go ahead and authenticate. That's forest-wide authentication. Essentially, you don't have to worry about authentication. The other way you can do it is called selective authentication. I'm going to do this for a lab environment because then you have to really specify every single setting and where and how users can log in. It's a little more illustrative, but it's also a little more complicated. Selective authentication means you have to go and be very specific about what users are allowed to log in and what resources those users have rights to. So I'm going to do selective, and I'll walk you through kind of where we're going to set that up. Hit next, next, and it is going ahead and applying the trust changes. It says it can't continue. Actually, this is a good point. I created a condition of forwarder from Apex to Summit. I did not do it the other way around, meaning if I'm going to the Summit side and trying to configure back, it's not going to work. So let's go fix that really quick. Desktop. I should be able to use the DNS name since I have DNS working one way. So summitdc.summit.corp. All right. Go to admin tools, DNS, conditional forwarders, and let's make the forwarder for our Apex domain. Okay, okay. Now let's go back here. Properties. Let's go ahead and hit validate. Trust has been validated, it is in place and active. So, yes. And that's routing. All right. So it does look like it, despite the fact that it can't continue, it does look like it worked, at least from our end. So let's go back to the other side and see if it's still set up here. So admin tools, domains and trusts. Remember, this is the GUI gotcha question. Where do you go to get to trusts? You should memorize. Right click, go to properties. It's in the trusts tab, and you'll see that the domain is listed here. Now it said it failed, so just to validate, let's go to properties, and you've got a validate button right here, and it's validated, it's in place and active. Okay, so everything should actually be working. This is all you have to do is set up a trust. So right now we have a trust that is active, that is working, but all that's saying is now authentication can occur for users across domains, however you set it up. In this case, we now can authenticate apex.local users logging into the summit.corp domain. However, that's just authentication. The other step for this is going to be actual permissions, authorization, so to speak. So in order to set that up, we'll close out of this. We're going to go to our AD console. and this is how we configure permissions. So the two sets of permissions that we have to configure in order to get this to work. Before I do this, actually, let me go back and show I have some groups pre-populated in this domain. This is the apex.local domain. If I go to groups, this is going to be familiar from working on our child domain. I have already created this group called SEC Server Admins. I'm just going to pretend that anybody who's in this Server Admins group should have access to the summit.corp domain. So this is the group I'm going to use to configure permissions. There are two places you have to do that. One, the first thing you have to do is you need to make sure advanced features is enabled. I have to go to my domain controllers themselves, go to properties, security, and add a security permission to allow members of that group to authenticate. Now, just like I did in the EU domain when I wanted to enable, when I went to the universal group and then I needed to add users from apex.local, first thing I have to do is go to location and select the other trusted domain apex.local. Hit OK. And now I can type in the name of that group, just start the prefix, and it's going to prompt me for credentials because I'm accessing information in Apex. I need to have rights to access that. So Apex and admin. And now it's reading that Active Directory information, and you'll notice two things. I have the server administrator group from eu.apex.local, and I have the server admins group from my apex.local domain. The reason I'm seeing both of these is because I have a transitive trust in place, meaning it can now read from any child domain because it's transitive. I'm going to select my root apex.local domain group. Hit OK. Hit OK. Now I've got the permission entry here, and for the ACL, I need to check allow for allowed to authenticate. All this is saying is that if I have traffic incoming and the user is a member of this group, it is allowed to hit the DC and authenticate those users. So that's the first set of permissions. On every domain controller, you need to make sure that they're allowed to authenticate. If this is only if you have a selective trust. If you have a forest trust in place where it's not selective, it doesn't matter. You don't have to do this. But because I am setting it so I've very specifically set what's allowed, I have to come into the domain controllers and do this. And I'm assigned to this group. Hit OK. And then like I mentioned earlier, I don't have member servers. So it's not like I can go to that server or the workstation and grant rights to those devices. I only have a domain controller. The way to grant rights on a domain controller is if I don't want to, I can't use the built-in groups here, like the domain admins group. This is normally how I grant rights to a domain controller. But if I go here and hit add, I don't see the apex.local domain because this is domain-specific groups. It can't read from another one. However, if you go into the built-in groups, this is just like the local server groups, only on a domain controller. So if I go into built-in and go to administrators, I can then access that apex.local domain, and I should be able to just do the same thing here. Check names. It still needs credentials from Apex. And I will select the same group from the root domain. Hit OK. Hit OK. Hit apply. And that's all I have to do. I have my permission saying on the DCs that those users are allowed to authenticate to the domain. And then I have the permissions in administrators saying for the domain controller itself, that group is also allowed to log in and manage the domain controller because it's got access to the administrators group. This is basically mimicking what you'd have to do to grant rights to a specific server by adding that group to the local administrators group on that server. Now, all that is configured, so I should be able to sign out of this, reopen my remote desktop console, connect to the same server, Summit DC, and this time I'm going to use an account from Apex. I believe it's levans-adm, seeing it's an admin account. Hit log in, and boom, I'm now logged into a Summit server using an Apex login based on that one-way trust. It will not work the other way around because that trust has not been established two-way. It's only one way, but now I have rights. that is all that I wanted to cover for forests and trusts. I do have this whole lab environment that I'm using here set up and available on GitHub for you to deploy yourself and go through some of the same scenarios. Just like every lesson, I'm creating lab scenarios along with instructions for how to complete them and quiz questions that are kind of pertain back to the exam, things you should know. And I will reiterate once again, if you have not watched it yet, go back and watch the intro video to the AZ-800 content, because I go over what the resources are, how you should be using them, and how you can maximize your learning from this content. With that being said, that wraps this video. Next week, we're going to be talking more about replication, which is a lot more likely to be something you'd encounter in a real world scenario, but I wanted to be separate from this because this is going to be more theoretical, a little more obscure. Thanks for watching. Like always, like and subscribe because it helps me as a content creator to get credit for these videos. And I hope you learned well, and I will see you next week.